All right. Today starts the kind of last section of our class where we're going to start talking about specific transportation and energy related policies and the sorts of modeling efforts that have gone into them. So this is kind of connecting a lot of the stuff that we've learned so far in class to sort of real world applications. So the policy we'll be talking about today is the corporate average fuel economy standards. This is near and dear to my heart. This is what my dissertation was on when I was a grad student. So the first thing we need to learn about is the difference between legislation and regulation. This is kind of the general schematic for laws in the United States, but a lot of other countries kind of follow a similar type of pattern. So I think most people hopefully are somewhat familiar with the legislative process. These are laws that are made by like Congress. So what happens is a senator or someone in the House of Representatives can introduce a law. And that has to go through this whole procedural process of going through the respective House and Senate, as well as through committees that basically sort of evaluate and change the bill. Once it gets passed by Congress, it's finalized when it's signed by the president. And then it becomes a law, which is basically a requirement that has kind of the sort of full force of the law behind it. Any questions about that process? All right. There is a different way that laws get made, and this is through regulatory procedures. So this is a little bit different. Regulations are made by federal agencies at the federal level, and there are also state level ones as well. This is a lot of this process is analogous to state level laws. But agencies basically will propose a rulemaking, and that goes out into the public, and the public is allowed to comment and provide feedback for some period of time, usually not less than, say, about 60 days, although it can be a lot longer. And then once that's done, the public commenting period closes. The regulatory agencies are actually required to address all the comments. They don't have to necessarily change anything if they don't want to, but they take those comments into account and then publish a sort of final rule. And that final rule has the same force of law that any law passed by Congress does. Congress can overwrite regulatory requirements through the sort of legislative rulemaking process, but that's not too common. The other one is that legislators can actually tell regulators to try and make some kind of regulation, and they do so by passing a law that's sort of broader in scope that regulatory agencies can then kind of take on. So an example of this recently would be like the Clean Mile standard in California, where the legislature directed the California Air Resources Board to develop a specific regulation, basically forcing transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft to electrify their vehicles. So legislators can tell regulators kind of what to regulate. Okay. Any questions about this? Why would we have this process? Like, why do we have both a legislature and regulators? Why not just have Congress take care of this? Yeah.
I guess Congress is sort of spoiled. Like uniquely detail-oriented things that they don't have time to be bothering.
Yeah, it's more so. Yeah.
Are you asking why there needs to be regulators and people to make the law?
Yes.
Or you make the law and regulators have to accomplish it?
No, so the point is more that both legislators and regulators can make laws. So why don't we just have legislators? So it's more closely related to your second point, which is you can imagine that regulators within, let's say, the Environmental Protection Agency know a lot more about how pollution and air quality and health damages work compared to sort of members who are elected by the general public. So regulatory agencies have this body of expertise and knowledge that goes way beyond what legislators would know. And that is the sort of fundamental difference and the reason why you want like a body with expertise regulating specific laws, because they may be too complex or beyond the sort of knowledge that you would expect from a legislative body. Okay. So the role of modeling in policy analysis, when we think about the developments of public policy, right? So this can be, for example, the formation of a law. Oftentimes, this requires some quantitative understanding or analysis, right? So, if we're just talking about climate change, for example, and we say, well, humans emit carbon and that leads to global warming, and then all this bad stuff happens. Well, if you don't have some way of like quantifying that, you can imagine that trying to make a regulation or a legislative law to kind of deal with that problem becomes really difficult, right? And so the public policy community oftentimes, for certain bodies of laws and regulations requires quantitative understanding, oftentimes coming from modeling. So in this particular example, this is our legislative process. The representative drafts a bill, it's introduced, there's a bunch of committee hearings, the legislature votes for the bill, and then the executive signs for the bill. And there are a lot of points within this whole process where you can inject knowledge, right? Some analysis provides an idea for representatives to draft new bills. So if someone publishes some paper that becomes kind of well-known and points out this big problem, a legislative staff could pick it up and say, hey, this is something that we should look at. This has happened before. I'm trying to think of examples, but they're not coming immediately to my head. Yeah.
Is it normally that policymakers come to science or science goes to policy?
It's both, for sure, it's both. So like this has definitely happened before, even here at Davis. And then there have been cases where so modeling can provide guidance on bill design. So I've actually been asked to testify on behalf of certain bills. So like legislative staff members will come and say, hey, congressmen, or not congressmen, because in the state level, I'm totally blanking. assemblyman, yeah, assembly member Markey or Quirk is passing this bill, and we'd like you to, you know, testify based on your research. So I've done that a couple times and been approached to basically come or go to a committee hearing and testify on research. Yeah, it's an interesting process. Like oftentimes it's hard to keep up with all the bills that get introduced and which ones actually have a chance, and like which ones are going to certain committees when and where. So if you're in the field and you're super active, you can kind of catch on to these things, but oftentimes it's someone reaching out. Yeah, and it's interesting because as an employee of UC Davis, we are not allowed to take positions on bills. So oftentimes they'll ask for you to support a bill, but you can only testify in a neutral role, and you can't and you have to get up there and say that to maintain sort of neutrality. But okay. Yeah. I don't know the exact legal reason for that, but basically every time I go, the lawyers tell me not to support the bill, because then it could be construed as the university supports a bill, and that apparently presents a lot of problems, but it's beyond my pay grade. Okay, so models can help assess potential impact of a policy. This can happen through guidance consulting or expert testimony. Some of it could be completely behind the scenes where you might not even know, as staff members research the background of a particular topic related to a bill, they may stumble across your paper or some results from a consulting gig. And so a lot of the, I guess I would say more thorough and sort of better assembly members and senators and representatives at the federal level, their staff will try and be a little bit more sort of robust in understanding the nuances and background behind the topics that they're looking at. Yeah, and sort of, even if you're not involved in sort of the initial process, the bill has to get voted on by a whole sort of body of people. And so significant modeling efforts can influence whether people vote for the bill, or even whether or not the executive signs the bill, right? Either the president or the governor. So that's kind of the schema for legislative regulation. Oh yeah, and I should also mention, so retrospective analysis. So this is really important too. A lot of bills, not all bills, but many bills often have some evaluation policy or some kind of midterm review where they can see if the intent of the bill is being carried out, if there's any sort of unintended consequences, right? And the evaluation of the impact of any legislation oftentimes, happens through some kind of modeling approach. Not always, again, but that is another area where modeling can play a really important role. Yeah, so there's basically things to do still when even after the law has been passed. So in a regulatory rulemaking process, right? So the rulemaking is announced, there's a public commenting period. This is the big time for people to really kind of get involved. And so as it's similar to before, analysis can provide ideas for new regulation. They can assess potential impact of a policy, provide guidance on, okay, I guess these aren't bills, but on the rulemaking design, and then same thing, retrospective analysis. Most regulatory laws that at least I've been involved with will have this sort of thing where you have a midterm review after implementation. And the review period allows for modification of the regulation. Okay, any questions about this process? All right. So today we'll be talking about a specific regulation and thinking about the sort of modeling process that has gone into it. So to motivate this, there are a couple sort of broadly important issues related to this regulation. And so one is we use a lot of oil, and to improve national security and decrease reliance on oil, we want to make vehicles more efficient. That also helps to contribute lowering of both air pollution and greenhouse gases. And so that has led this sort of general trend from, dirtier, less fuel efficient cars to, our poster boy for efficient vehicles, Priuses. Okay. So a brief history of the corporate average fuel economy standards. So this first came about in the 1970s. There was a big oil crisis that happened due to OPEC, which is an oligopoly for oil. They basically are able to control prices and to some extent the sort of supply line of this fossil fuel. And there was basically a huge shortage in the early 1970s. And as a result, this Energy Policy and Conservation Act was passed with a whole bunch of goals. So increased energy production and supply, reduce energy demand, provide energy efficiency, and provide more powers to respond to disruptions in our energy supply. So it was a pretty wide-ranging bill, but one of the things that it did was, so this is what I was mentioning before, that the legislature can direct regulatory agencies to regulate specific things. And in this case, this bill required the US DOT, the Department of Transportation, and specifically a subgroup within the DOT called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which we refer to as NHTSA, to enforce compliance with fuel efficiency standards. So this is a nice example of Congress directing the DOT to create this new regulation. So here is a somewhat outdated plot, but this is the corporate average fuel economy standards historically. So there's a bunch of lines here, what's going on. So you've got a red line and a green, or sorry, a red line and a blue line. The blue line was the first one. So this is for passenger cars. And then the red line is for light duty trucks. The dotted line refers to the actual fuel efficiency of those vehicles. And then the dotted blue line here. And the green line refers to the combined fuel efficiency between light duty trucks and passenger cars. Couple things to note. This is on an axis of grams of CO2 per mile, which is directly equivalent to miles per gallon. The MPG is actually what's regulated by NHTSA. But these are directly equivalent. You will notice, however, that the MPG is in a nonlinear scale. This is that whole 1/x that we have talked about before. And then I have these little vertical lines here indicating anytime changes have been made to CAFE. So I haven't included sort of more recent ones, but we'll talk about that later on. And so over time, the standards have changed. And every time the standard gets updated, it has to go through a new rulemaking process. The other particular thing to notice here is how flat this line is. So that's the actual rule. And so, so going from high to low is better because that's the emissions rate. And it's inverted here. So as you go from high to low, you're going from low fuel efficiency to a higher fuel efficiency. But for a long period of time, from 1990 all the way up through the mid 2000s, we can see that passenger vehicles was flat. Similar with trucks for a long period of time, although they actually did start decreasing before cars did. So we'll keep that in mind, and as we think about sort of the historical aspects of this standard. So one sort of common misconception is that all the cars need to be at a certain fuel efficiency. In reality, it's the average sales weighted fuel efficiency for every manufacturer to meet a specific target, which means that if I have like a 35 mpg requirement, I don't need to produce all the cars that I produce don't need to meet that requirement. But the average of the cars that I sell have to meet that requirement. So I'm allowed to produce cars that are 25 mpg as long as I balance that out cars that are like 40 mpg, right? Okay, so who can tell me, if I am an automaker, what is the average fuel economy for a manufacturer that sells 10, 20 mpg cars and 10, 30 mpg cars? $25. Incorrect. This is a trick question again. This is the same 1/x thing. So you have 10, 25 miles. So the way that we have to do this is to do a harmonic average. So this is, sorry. 10 cars that are 20 mpg, 10 cars that are 30 mpg is equal to 20 over my average. So if you solve for this, x equals 20 divided by 1/2 plus 1/3. This is going to be slightly under, it'll be 24 point something. Yeah. So again, this is all because we in the US decide to do MPG instead of liters per kilometer. It makes all these calculations slightly more complicated. Sorry for tricking you. Okay. So there's this whole crediting system. When an automaker complies with the regulation, they generate some number of credits based off of their target. And then these credits can actually be traded between different automakers, and they can also be banked. So let's say my target is 30 MPG, but in a particular year, I happen to sell vehicles that average out to 31 MPG. I can get some excess credits, and I can take that and I can sell them to another automaker. Let's say some automaker was only got to 29 MPG. Then they can buy those credits from me and use those to fulfill the regulation. I can take those credits and say, hey, I don't think I'm going to make it next year, so I'm going to use these credits and bank them for now and then use them later. So if you violate the standard, then NHTSA can enforce civil penalties. And it costs $50 per 1 MPG that you're out of compliance per vehicle. So if I sell 1,000 cars and I'm required to be at 30 MPG, but I only get up to 29 MPG, then I can get charged $55,000, right? Because there's 1,000 vehicles on average out of compliance. So the historical precedent has typically been Asian automakers. So think Honda, Toyota, Hyundai, Kia. These guys have usually been exceeding compliance. So they generate banks of credits. And we don't really observe too much trading happening. That only usually happens within like an automaker group. American manufacturers tend to be right around compliance. And then a lot of European automakers tend to be out of compliance and just pay penalties. And so between 1978 and 2008, you can see a lot of the luxury brands, they just choose to pay the penalty as opposed to comply. The regulation still works for these guys, right? It's there's still this strong signal to improve fuel efficiency because this can start to get out of hand if you're really out of whack. And so, yes, these guys are in violation, but in general, it still pushes them to improve the fuel efficiency when possible. Okay, any questions about this? Yeah. No. So the one you're thinking of is the zero emission vehicles regulation, and we will talk about that. But Tesla is able to make money from this, but this is not the sort of big one that they make a lot of money on. Yeah, and I should also say, just as a nuance, which we'll talk about in a second, but the CAFE is not an emissions regulation. It is a fuel efficiency regulation, and okay, they are kind of directly related, but the key nuance is that NHTSA under the DOT does not have the authority to regulate emissions. But they do have the authority to regulate fuel efficiency. And that's gonna create a whole weird world in a hot second. So before we get to talking about some of the sort of modern day issues, I'll just kind of mention that there have been a huge number of studies on the impact of cafe. So you'll note that a lot of these studies are a little bit older, kind of pre-2010 era. And that's kind of on purpose because a whole bunch of stuff is about to change. But thinking about what impacts cafe has had, right? Obviously, the idea was to reduce oil consumption, and that has led to a corresponding decrease in emissions. And people have attempted to measure the change that has happened because of cafe. So there's this huge sort of body of work here, and you know, these guys are measuring this and modeling it in very different ways. So if folks are interested, they can take a look. Some of these are more sort of engineering-based analyses, and then some of these are more sort of top-down economic, like regression-based modeling. Equilibrium modeling, looking at sort of changes in the system, like how automakers have responded, how that affects the economy, that sort of thing. Life cycle assessments, so a deeper look at impacts involving sort of upstream processes, so including things like production of the vehicles, fuel production, and then even sort of decision making, looking at how automakers have essentially adapted and changed the way that they produce their vehicles, or what kind of design decisions they're making related to production of the vehicles because of cafe. Okay, so I was mentioning a whole bunch of stuff happening in the more sort of recent years. Okay, so remember what I was saying earlier when we were looking at that plot where the cafe standards was like really flat for a long period of time. So for almost 20 years, sort of starting with the Bush senior administration in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, the cafe standards got frozen. So fuel efficiency flattened, right? We had looked at some of these trends before, and then this led to automakers investing a lot more into, you know, improving the power and increasing the size of the vehicles, and so on. So in California, this senator, Fran Pavley, decided, well, we want our vehicles to still be increasing in fuel efficiency. We want to improve air quality. And so she authored this bill in the assembly, AB 1493, which is sort of commonly called the Pavley regulations. And essentially what this would do would be to regulate efficiency of vehicles within California. Okay, so we need to go back in time a little bit. Actually, let me make sure if I have a specific slide on this. No, okay, this is in the other thing. Okay, so if there's a federal law that legislates or regulates something, are states allowed to create a law to do the same thing? Anyone know?
So there can be a difference in the federal law versus state law, like marijuana or something.
Yeah, kind of like that. So technically speaking, you're not allowed to do that. Like states aren't allowed to do that. That's kind of like the whole point of the federal system, is that the federal laws can overrule any sort of state level law. And so states can have laws to legislate or regulate things that haven't already been regulated or legislated on. So creating a fuel efficiency standard in California that's different from the federal standard technically isn't allowed to happen.
I thought under the Constitution that states have the right to create their own laws.
No, they do, but they can't overrule federal law. Yeah. So basically, so in the Constitution, the main idea is like, okay, we're going to leave states the authority to create laws and regulate things, and one state can't tell another state what to do. But in any cases where federal law is passed, it can override and overrule any state level law. There are some nuances to this, but generally this is how it works. So we need to go back in time a little bit to talk about the Clean Air Act. So in the 1970s, the late 1970s, the US passed the Clean Air Act and legislated a whole bunch of stuff related to emissions. There is a special provision in section 177 of the Clean Air Act, which grants other states a sort of ability to get a special waiver. Sorry, that's not quite true. When the Clean Air Act was passed federally, California already had a Clean Air Act. Okay. But because California's Clean Air Act's requirements were more stringent than the federal requirements, they said, California, you guys are allowed to keep yours. And in fact, not only that, if any other state wants to join California's version of the Clean Air Act, they are welcome to do so. So that's the section 177. It's other states are allowed to opt into California's rulemaking. So they said, okay, California, for any sort of future changes that you might make to your Clean Air Act, anything regulating emissions, you are allowed to request a waiver from the EPA to basically have your own regulation sort of separate from the federal rule. And so this is how they get around the issue of having a state regulation that sort of overrides the federal regulation. So to do this, they would need to request a waiver from the EPA. And so this was done in December of 2005, and it was eventually denied by the Bush Jr. administration in the US EPA in March of 2008. Okay, so by not being able to obtain this waiver, then this regulation essentially was not allowed to be implemented. Okay, so this is all this stuff that's happening in California at the time. At the same time, sort of right around this sort of time period, there was this really famous court case. So folks who are interested in climate change should be aware of this thing. So this is the state of Massachusetts and actually a bunch of other states. They were suing the EPA to determine whether they had the legal authority to regulate carbon dioxide. Okay, so the Environmental Protection Agency is a regulatory agency that is meant to regulate things as it relates to the cleanliness of our air and the cleanliness of our water. So this refers in general or historically to pollutants, local air pollutants which affect local health impacts. However, there are also emissions that affect global warming, right? CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, so CO2, methane, N2O. And these things don't have a local air quality impact. These are not local air pollutants. And so EPA chose not to regulate them, basically under the argument that these aren't under the purview of their regulatory powers. And so Massachusetts sued and basically argued that that EPA has the legal authority to regulate CO2. And so the Supreme Court ultimately ended up ruling that not only does the EPA have the authority, but they are required to regulate CO2 emissions. And so this was kind of a landmark case that opened up EPA authority to regulate carbon dioxide. Okay, so we're kind of coming to this a big head here. So March 2008, Bush administration denied the waiver, but then end of 2008, Obama gets elected and they immediately grant the waiver for the California Air Resources Board. And so the Department of Transportation is like, hey, like we got this, like we already are regulating fuel efficiency. And then now we have these two agencies, a federal level agency and then a state level agency trying to kind of do the same thing. And then all of a sudden we have the Environmental Protection Agency coming in and saying, hang on, like we're gonna do this. Like your fuel efficiency standards suck and we're gonna make them way more stringent. So if you are an automaker, you hate this. You, like, as much as you may not like fuel efficiency standards, you really don't like 3 different standards, right? Like, okay, now I have to produce a special set of cars just for California, and then all the other states that participate in California's rule. And then I have to figure out all the nuances between these guys. So we've got what is known as the One National Program. So automakers have this huge protest following 3 different standards is going to be way too crazy. There is merit to that argument. So these 3 agencies come and sit at the table and they agree to harmonize the standards so they basically match for the most part. Not completely, but generally they're going to match. So the CAFE standards, again, are going to regulate miles per gallon. And now there's this new thing, the EPA called the Greenhouse Gas Emission Standard, which is almost completely analogous to the CAFE standards. And this regulates grams of CO2 per mile. And now they are, for the most part, the same. CARB backs out and they say, all right, we'll let you guys do it, but only under the condition that it's going to be really strict. So it was actually really good that ARB was brought to the table because they made the standards like way more stringent than would have happened without them. And so CARB only agrees to back out if the regulations are set to a high enough level. And so, yeah, they had a lot of influence in the rulemaking. in this case. So all of this was happening in the sort of like 2009, 2010 time period. And that regulation initially began to be applied starting in 2012. And that initial rulemaking kind of provided a timeline and guidance all the way out to 2025, even though the regulation is actually required to be updated a couple times before then. There's this famous 55 mpg by 2025. That's kind of the big punchline of these CAFE standards. Note that this is on a 2-cycle test. So real world conditions, this is probably closer to like 37, 38 mpg, but still a lot better than it was today. They're not actually allowed to regulate for 14 years. So the regulation is split into 2 phases, and they have these midterm reviews and that have a chance to kind of change the standards. Okay, any questions about this? Yes. Yeah, okay, good question. Well, I'm actually going to talk about that in just a second. But it's not this sort of arbitrary number that's just like, okay, we're going to pick something and hope that the automakers can get there. Yeah. Oh, well, we're going to get there, believe me. Oh man, it's gonna, you think this part was crazy. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just, going back to your question about 55. Yeah, so we don't pull, regulatory agencies usually don't pull numbers out of a hat, right, randomly. And actually there's a whole sort of big modeling effort that goes into trying to determine this. Okay, a couple sort of small nuances. This part gets really confusing. I don't even know if I should still include this, but we have changed the average requirements to a footprint-based standard. Okay, so when I say 55 mpg, that is kind of a holistic average type of number, but not every individual automaker will have to get to 55 mpg. And in fact, automakers don't have the same targets. The targets depend strictly on the average footprint of the vehicles. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, let me draw this out really quick. A vehicle's footprint, if I'm looking at a car sort of top down, and I have my 4 wheels like this, this distance here is the wheelbase. That is the distance between your wheels. And then this distance here is known as the track length. And that's the distance between the axles of your wheel. And so a footprint, the footprint of your vehicle is not the sort of total dimensions. The footprint is equal to the wheelbase times the track length. So there's this idea that, well, certain automakers make smaller cars, certain automakers make larger cars. We don't want to like penalize certain automakers because of the types of cars that they produce. And therefore, automakers will have a different standard based off of the footprint of their vehicle. And this is basically saying, well, if you produce a lot of larger cars, then we're going to let you have a sort of higher standard, or sorry, we're going to let them have a lower MPG target or a higher emissions rate target. And as the years go on, that target will drop, and depending where you are sort of on this blue line, that determines your rate. There's this thing for light duty vehicles. You'll notice that the footprint is flat after a certain point. And this flat area is a lot longer. And that has to do with the fact that there were like essentially special provisions provided to American automakers who produced a lot more sort of larger trucks to make it easier to fulfill the fuel efficiency. Does anyone see a problem with this? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so someone did oh yeah.
So what happens when like foreign automakers sell cars that are very specific cars that they sell like the sell in Europe versus in the US? How do they deal with the different
Yeah. A little bit of both, but generally the cars in the US are going to be a little bit different from the cars in China and the cars in Europe. Sometimes, let's say they think it's not worth it to do it, and then in some cases they'll be out of compliance with the regulation and they'll just pay fines, but it's definitely both. The types of cars here are definitely going to be a little different from the cars in Europe.
So this is not too far, but if these regulations are for automakers,
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there possibilities that like the consider to be with affects with car like fines and car and stuff? Is that maybe I'm taking this too far, but
It'd be the ability to regulate something like that would be very difficult. Yeah, because you're talking about regulating 40 to 50 individuals as opposed to 300, 400 million individuals, right? Yeah. The other thing is like, you can really take it to an extreme, right? So let's say you and I are neighbors and we both drive the exact same car and we both come to school one day. Do we use the same amount of fuel to come to drive from, you know, our neighborhood to school? Like, let's say two people just right next to each other. You're shaking your head. Why not? Yeah. Differences in driving behavior. So actually one of the biggest, easily one of the biggest things that affects fuel efficiency is your mood. If I'm, you know, heavy on the gas pedal and you know, I'm like a road rager and I'm speeding past people and all that, you're going to use a lot more fuel compared to someone who's just, you know, driving steadily at an efficient rate. And so, if I really wanted to regulate fuel efficiency, that's one of the things that I would target, right? But it's kind of the same idea. It's regulating individuals is too difficult, both procedurally, but you can imagine that you're going to get a lot more sort of political pushback if people are telling you how to drive compared to if you're trying to regulate an automaker.
So,
Yeah.
I've never bought a new car.
Yeah.
But when you buy a new car, there's like the price of the car and then there's like
Yeah.
it's sort of like a package, right? Are any of those fees related to like
To this, yes. Yeah, heck yeah.
you bought a truck versus a Prius?
Yeah, but okay, here's the thing. So it gets really complex because there's all this like supply and demand stuff, right? And so people who want a truck, they're often paying a bigger premium anyways. And so if I'm an automaker, all right, and I just want to make money, like I definitely will sell as many trucks as possible because the relative profit, the profit margin on a truck or a van is like way higher than on a car. I'm talking like 4, 5, 10 times higher in terms of profit margin. Yeah, and people are willing to pay that. So the problem is I can't just sell trucks. Okay. If I were just to sell trucks and I'm out of compliance, eventually, the sort of penalties are going to sort of balance out with the money that I'm making. And so what that means is that, okay, people want to buy trucks. I want to sell trucks, but I have to sell, let's say, cars, some small cars or whatever, to make them more compelling. So you're not going to see specific like fine or specific fees on like line items, but what they're going to do is they're going to try and alter the prices of the cars in such a way that the supply and demand works out that they can meet this. So what does that mean? So in like a generic easy example for what we're talking about, maybe I will price the trucks a little bit higher and maybe I'll make my cars a little bit cheaper so that more people will buy the cars and fewer people will buy the trucks, right? So it's a constant balance for the automakers to like make as much money as possible, but still comply with the regulation. Okay, did you have a question?
I was thinking about the behavior monitoring of driving, and it's not for what is it called, like greenhouse gas emissions or anything, but insurance companies already do that.
Yep.
It's like kind of dicey.
Yes, people don't like that, right? Like that you'd be like being monitored for the way you drive.
Yeah, and not just that, but I'm like, what if you get into someone else's car or an Uber or something?
Yeah.
How do you know if I'm driving?
Yeah.
They do it by an app on your phone.
Yeah. As I understand, a lot of that is like, it's not like, oh, penalty for your behavior. It's like a extra incentive for your behavior. So it will lower your insurance rate rather than raise your insurance rate. A lot of insurance companies are starting to do stuff like this. Specific types of certain insurance companies will offer like, hey, if you download this app and allow us to monitor your behavior, if you fall under certain criteria, then we'll knock like 10% off of your insurance bill, something like that. Oh yeah.
When I talk about people that I know who are like amazing drivers, they always are in the red zone. Like I've never seen them.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well.
I don't know what the like savings are. It doesn't say the savings, but it does say like what's your rate of driver on the app, and every person I know is opted in. It's like in the red zone.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people.
Okay.
My parents are like, so we're gonna buy you a car using a student bank discount, then think you can get us a nice fat discount on our insurance as well, you have to use the app.
Mhm.
So I'm actually one of those people who actually does really well.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there you go.
Using farmers insurance on their own metrics. So they focus on focus time specifically. They also focus on excessive speeding.
Yeah.
Just like your regular speeding, but excessive speeding.
Yeah.
Time of day and total mileage.
Is it through your car or just through the app?
Through the app.
How did I know when you're driving? Oh, if you're using GPS, then
And
it
so
has to
literally
be.
what I have to go through is like I have to go through here, like, okay, so I definitely drove from Sacramento to Davis, I definitely did. But I did not drive from Mercer Island to Bellevue, Washington. I did not do that. Passenger. That's a market.
So it does do other people's stuff too, okay.
Yeah.
It's.
It's-
They do the rating too, so they start you off at a 10% more. We're just having an app.
Yeah.
And of course, that's just from the house, if you have everybody on the plan on the plan. Then they add on top. They, I guess like a belt, they only add, they don't subtract.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No.
So for me, I got a 12.4% discount because I was slightly above average.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it could go up to 15%.
But at the same time, couldn't they, I don't know, I'm not gonna get into it.
Yeah, so this world is becoming increasingly common. I mean, I could be wrong, like maybe there will be individual regulation at some point, but I don't see that happening. Okay, at least in this area. Yeah. Well, there are benefits, right? Like people do it so that they can save money.
But are you saving money? Because I feel like they're telling you have a discount, but at the same time, like each time that you get a new insurance policy, every 6 months, they evaluate all that information you've given them.
Mhm.
It could be that they want the price you higher, and then they're like, here's your 12% discount, like, I don't know about that.
There's also some insurance companies, they also determine where you live. So Sacramento.
Yeah.
You move from anywhere else in Sacramento.
Yeah.
Because if you've been on the causeway, you'll see why.
Yeah.
Because it's like massive.
Yeah. So, I mean, so I sense some skepticism there, but what I will say is that the way that insurance works, right? And we've talked about this is, you're assessing risk of certain things. And so the more information that you have about the risk, the better you can evaluate the expected values of an accident or something occurring, right? And the corresponding rates that are associated with a particular level of risk. So without speaking to anything about like gamesmanship on the insurance company end, like providing more information should in theory lower rates, especially for people who can demonstrate like a lower than sort of baseline risk. But okay, but let's not get too wrapped up in that. I want to go back to this thing here. So yeah, so I think one of the things Duncan was pointing out was that, okay, there actually becomes this incentive for me to want to try and make my cars, I'm not going to say bigger necessarily, but increase the footprint of the vehicle. And so there was this paper by Katie Whitefoot, who's this mechanical engineer, that did this equilibrium modeling to look at the trade-offs between footprint and production costs, and basically predicted that as a result of this regulation, that automakers would increase the footprint of their vehicles. And that's exactly what happened. So cars got a little bit bigger, but generally what happened was that cars got a little bit wider so they could increase the wheelbase, and then they moved the wheels closer to the edges of the vehicle so that the track length could also increase. There are some like physical benefits to doing this, but like this happened entirely, right, due to the nuances of the CAFE regulation. Yeah, it actually makes turning better. No, no way. I mean, automakers do look at some of this research, right? But like they're definitely onto this, like as soon as the regulation, even when it was sort of being announced, right? But you can really consistently see average footprint of vehicles over the years, CAFE regulation, and it starts going up. Okay, so going back to this question about how the standards are set, where does the 55 mpg come from? So there are a set of models, Omega and Volpe. These are used by NHTSA and EPA, respectively. And basically, what they did is, as the regulations are being developed, I'm going to go and have it sit down individually with all the automakers and with other experts. And you do this expert elicitation process. And we say, okay, you know, how much do you think it costs to install direct fuel injection? How much does it cost to do turbocharging? You know, how much does it cost to do lightweighting? And so they elicit all of this technology cost information sort of across the industry, across all these experts, and they plug it into this model, this Omega or Volpe model, and then they develop this sort of market information, and they use this actually, vehicle choice model is more recent, but this whole procedure sort of allows the regulatory agencies to gain some insight as to what technologies exist, how much they cost, what does that mean for how much they think fuel efficiency can be decreased in the future and at different sort of levels of cost. And then they make some judgment about, okay, we want to make the companies spend, you know, no more than this amount of money over the next couple of decades. And we think that feasibly means they can get to some target. And so that's kind of where this 55 mpg number comes from. There's this whole sort of modeling process that backs that number up. Following the regulation, academics kind of convened a bunch of experts to look at these costs as well as a way to kind of verify and provide updates, especially to the midterm review of the standards. And so these are a whole bunch of these technologies that can help improve efficiency, anywhere from low friction lubricants to help the sort of rolling resistance of the vehicle, all the way to, you know, downsizing of the vehicle. Yeah, and like mass reduction, right? So there's a whole set of technologies that do this. And this National Academy study employed a whole bunch of, you know, things that we've talked about. So forecasting prices for technologies and for fuels. They do a whole bunch of financial analysis, looking at net present values, total cost of operation of vehicles. They did this wedge analysis, it's actually coming from that National Academy's study. So wedge techniques, this is in reference to incrementally improving efficiency of the vehicles and how they sort of add up. They look at a whole bunch of scenarios for different sort of adoption levels and what that means for petroleum consumption. Yeah, and life cycle analysis, Monte Carlo simulations. It's all in there. Okay, so a lot of the sort of fundamental techniques that we talk about get applied in sort of different ways in this particular regulation. This is work that actually I did where we replicated the EPA's Omega model and then input the updated cost from the National Academy study. And the main purpose of this was actually to look at policy interactions where we added in the California zero emission vehicle mandate. So the basic idea behind this paper was that the regulatory agencies say, okay, we don't want automakers to spend some amount of money, some monetary target, right, to reach this 55 mpg, and they do it by using technologies in sort of a specific order, kind of from the cheapest to the lowest to meet energy efficiency requirements, right? And so maybe that means, okay, first everyone's going to do, you know, lubricants for rolling resistance, then everyone's going to do direct fuel injection, and then everyone's going to do turbocharging, and so on and so forth. And you go from the cheapest to most expensive. But on that chart of like technology things that you could do to improve fuel efficiency, one of the least efficient, or one of the most expensive ones, is to electrify the vehicle. But because you have the zero emissions mandate, it makes everyone jump out of order, right, and electrify the vehicles first. So then we wanted to reevaluate what that would mean from a cost basis to automakers. Yeah, and so there's this sort of optimization-based model that that looked at that. Okay, some nuances, some other nuances about the regulation. So the fuel economy and the emission rates are no longer tied together. So federal, this is specifically for electric vehicles. So federal regulation is harmonized between NHTSA's CAFE and EPA's greenhouse gas emission standards, right? We've talked about this. But for alternative fuel vehicles, this is different. So this is a gas car, let's say a Toyota Prius. It has 55 mpg on the NHTSA efficiency side, and it has 160 grams of CO2 per mile on the emissions rate on the EPA side. But for a Tesla Model 3, okay, the efficiency is about 0.29 kilowatt hours per mile, but the emissions is like, who knows? It depends where you are, it depends what time you're charging. Now you've got this complete disconnect between emissions rate and fuel economy. So alternative fuel vehicles start to get really complicated in CAFE. There are additionally more complicated things. So they wanted to provide incentives to automakers to produce alternative fuel vehicles. And so they have these weights and these multipliers. So weights multiplicatively affect emissions rate for alternative fuel vehicles, and multipliers increase the accounting of sales for alternative fuel vehicles. Okay, what the heck does that mean? Let's say I'm Nissan and I sell a couple Nissan Leafs. Let's say I sell 10 of them. So when I go to do my true up in accounting for the fuel efficiency, basically a multiplier is going to increase the accounts here. So BEV, the multiplier is, let's say 2 in 2017 to 2019. So when I do my accounting and I do my harmonic averages to calculate the average fuel efficiency that Nissan sells, instead of saying I sold 10 Nissan Leafs, it says you sell 20 because you multiply by 2. So it doubles the number of vehicles that you sell just in the accounting part. For the weights, it affects the emissions rate. So for electric vehicles, it's just 0. So basically they're saying, if the effective emissions rate is say 50 grams of CO2 per mile, it's just gonna get multiplied by 0. So it just counts as 0. And that's a way they get around having to deal with the tailpipe issue and sort of this upstream and figuring this out. They just say it's all 0. Actually, let me jump back to that in a second. So there are some important implications of these alternative fuel vehicle incentives on fuel efficiency. Okay, so because of CAFE, every time, okay, let's go back to this example of this Nissan Leaf. Every time Nissan sells this Leaf, right, it's really clean. But because of the CAFE standards, that means they're now allowed to sell a dirty vehicle. So every time I sell a clean vehicle, I'm allowed to sell a dirty vehicle, right? And I'm incentivized to do that because the big vehicles are where I make my profit. And so to an extent, every clean vehicle is essentially balanced out by a dirty vehicle, and then until you meet your target. So that's what this is here. So this is my emission standard, and this is an example for a Chevy Volt. So that's this blue line here. And then you can sell some kind of dirtier car so that for every Volt that I sell, I balance out to this standard. And that's essentially what we find happens, right? Most of the auto companies are just right around the standard. But because we have these alternative fuel vehicle incentives, these weights and multipliers, it's actually worse because so if this is the emissions associated with selling the Chevy Volt, well, it actually counts lower because of the weights, right? It's not that emissions rate. We're saying it's some part of it will be multiplied by 0, and there's this whole multiplier thing. So the balancing vehicle actually looks like this. And so the difference between this red line and the artificial balancing that happens because of the incentives, the difference is like the extra emissions that happens because of having those incentives in place. So there's this whole nuance to this that actually leads to higher emissions, and we actually help to sort of measure this in this analysis, where we're able to sort of model out into the future how emissions would increase up to this sort of dot, depending on what policy scenarios that you have. Yeah, and then the last thing that I'll say about this sort of new age CAFE regulation. So it doesn't account for the regulation doesn't account for differences between electric vehicles, right? Because everything is counted as 0. So there's the most efficient electric vehicle on the market today is the Hyundai Ioniq, 25 kilowatt hours per 100 miles, and the least efficient is the Jaguar I-Pace, 44 kilowatt hours per 100 miles. So this is like the difference between like this relative difference in efficiency is equivalent to like comparing a Toyota Prius to a Ford Mustang. But the fuel economy regulations consider the vehicles to be the same because of the weights. So there aren't really any like signals from the regulation to improve efficiency of electric vehicles. Okay, so all of this stuff that I've been showing you, there's like all this research and academic analysis that was like following on the sort of footsteps of the regulation change during the Obama administration. It was a pretty kind of exciting time. because, you know, it's very progressive, but then there are all these like small nuances and issues that people were thinking about, especially kind of going into the sort of midterm review time period in 2016 to 2018. Basically, you know, as researchers and academics and the industry and other stakeholders are getting sort of active in this area, and we're starting to really inject like emissions issues, right? Because climate change is becoming a more and more important topic. You can see how, you know, in addition to a lot of the studies that I've just shown you, that there's just generally kind of a lot of interest and debate and discussion in this area. Okay, but things changed. Okay, so 2017 midterm review. So review of CAFE going from 2021 to 2025. So NHTSA isn't allowed to develop the regulation for more than 4 years at a time. So this was slated to happen over the course of 2017. So remember the way rulemaking happens, we announce a rulemaking, there's a proposed rule that the regulatory agency releases to the public. There's a long public commenting period of usually at least 60 days. And then they take in those comments, they address all of the comments, and then they can update the rule and then they publish that. So that's what's supposed to happen. Okay, end of 2016 rolls around. Trump gets elected. Uh-oh. So the Obama EPA in December suddenly releases a new proposed rule. This was supposed to happen in 2017. And they said, you have 1 week for public comments, right? This is a process that's supposed to usually take at least 2 months. So everyone is like, suddenly, we're all really shocked that this happened. Everyone's scrambling to put together comments. The automakers are panicking. So 1 week later, public comment period closes. And then like 3 days after the closing, they released the final rule with no changes. And they said, yeah, we looked at everyone's comments and we considered them and we have decided to keep the final rule as is. So, okay, obviously there's some like political gamesmanship happening here. But the idea is like, we need to get in these rules before the new administration like undoes them. And yeah, so what happened? Okay, I shouldn't even say CAFE today. This is CAFE during Trump's administration. Trump wanted to get rid of the CAFE regulation. And then the ex-director of now ex-director, or the first EPA dude under Trump, Scott Pruitt, made a bunch of moves to get rid of the regulation. So they do have some standing, they did have some standing to do this because the EPA pushed the regulation through so aggressively sort of at the end of 2016. That wasn't really kosher, and actually the executive is allowed to sort of overturn things that happen under his purview in the year preceding coming into office. So it was actually easier for them to kind of get rid of this. But there are a lot of institutional barriers to this. So it needs to go through a whole nother rulemaking process if you want to change it. And then there's all this substantial resistance from the environmental community. So you guys may have heard of this in the news. They eventually proposed this SAFE rule, which was the sort of midterm update to the CAFE standards. And so essentially what this would do was this would completely freeze the standards in 2021. So it would go back to being flat. Okay. And you can imagine a lot of the benefits that we would see in that time period would sort of vanish. They tried to do these calculations where they basically said, okay, there's like faster turnover, which is going to lead to higher costs with the old rules. And so that would mean that people would keep their cars longer, which would be less safe because the prices of cars would be going up. They reduced the carbon price in calculations of the benefits, and then they increased a lot of the technology costs. Yeah, and so this was kind of a lot of the justification for this rulemaking. So economists disagree. There was a really famous paper published in 2018 to look at all of these arguments that they were making about and how they were doing these calculations. And they're showing how like this was the old version of the cost benefit analysis in the Obama regulations, the benefits that you would get versus the costs. And then they were showing how the Trump administration was making some assumptions that would essentially change the cost to look like this when doing the cost benefit analysis. And this paper pointed out a lot of the sort of flaws in EPA and NHTSA's calculations under the Trump administration. So yeah, so a lot of this sort of important economic analysis underlying kind of the reasoning for the regulation. Let's see. So the safe rule had a huge number of comments, obviously, when this was proposed. There was a lot of pushback from the community, actually a lot of the former EPA administrators. It was actually funny. One of the strategic things that they ended up doing was they actually knew all of this would happen, and in the proposed rulemaking, they resubmitted the existing rule that got pushed through in December of 2016 as a way to require the administration to review that comments, right? And they have to look at all the comments, sort of under the auspices that when the safe rule eventually got to court, that would be part of the evidence that they would have to disprove against any new analysis, which was kind of hastily done and not very well done. So it was kind of setting up the evidence for the inevitable sort of court trial that would be evaluating the sort of legitimacy of this. Okay. So what happened? California decides to wade back into this. They preempt the safe rule, right? Remember that California has the ability to make their own regulation. They have to obtain this waiver, but they originally backed out of doing this in the Obama administration because they got everyone to sort of agree. But now that the standards were getting rolled back, they preempted it with their own sort of regulation. And the idea was that, okay, Trump is going to deny California the waiver. which means that California wouldn't have standing to do this. So they actually preempted this, knowing this would happen, and they went directly to the automakers and they said, will you guys voluntarily comply with whatever rules that we come up with? And so a bunch of automakers did do this. So Ford, Honda, BMW, Volkswagen, and Volvo basically said, we will agree to California's regulations, even if, I guess technically they're not required by law. GM, Chrysler, and Toyota end up siding with Trump after this happens. Ultimately, the SAFE rule ended up getting passed on March 31st, 2020. This is right. So the safer, affordable, fuel efficient rule passed by the Trump administration, but it wasn't actually quite as bad as a lot of people were expecting. When the final rule got pushed through, fuel efficiency improvements were decreased to 1.5% per year, down from 5%, but more than people thought, which was they thought it was just going to get frozen. So following the passage of the SAFE rule, immediately a bunch of stakeholders ended up suing, and then California was making a big push to have essentially their own fuel efficiency standards. The waiver ended up getting denied, but then we were kind of waiting for the new administration to come around, and so that has happened. So the last time I taught this class was 1 year ago, right? And where are we now? So just as kind of the latest update, in August of last year, new rulemaking proposed. You know, they got around to this very quickly for cafe standards in 2024 to 2026. So increase in stringency at an 8% rate compared to 1.5%. So completely undoing the Trump administration's regulatory requirements and making them actually a lot more aggressive. There was a regular 60-day comment period that actually got extended a little bit. But we're now kind of waiting around for the final rulemaking to come out. In December, the SAFE rule ended up getting repealed, so that's no longer happening. And because of this, California can step back again and not have to worry about kind of getting their own waiver. Actually, I haven't followed news on that recently. I don't know if they're still trying to pursue their set of regulations. Yeah, but so this is kind of where we are today. So the last 4 years has been stressful for the transportation community involved in this area, and now we can kind of sit back and breathe a sigh of relief and go back to some of these issues that we were thinking about back in the original Obama era regulations. Yeah, last thing I wanted to point out, there's the sort of modeling effort going into the CAFE standards has been sort of increasing in complexity and sophistication over time. And again, this is a sort of my attempt at highlighting the fact that a lot of this policymaking, regulatory rulemaking uses and really requires the need for modeling and systems modeling in order to properly get at the objectives that it's trying to get at. I think one of the sort of fundamental reasons why the SAFE rule just didn't really survive well is because fundamentally the analysis behind it was unsound. Okay, there aren't sort of really any scientists in the transportation and engineering communities who really agreed with the sort of calculations, sort of backing that rule. And there's definitely, assumptions and things that go into the regulations in, prior to the Trump era and even today. But those are types of things that we can argue about that maybe are a little bit more, subjective. Whereas I think you'd have a really hard time kind of defending some of the assumptions being made by the Trump administration. And that's why it's important to know this stuff and to get it right. So, okay, any questions or comments, concerns? This has been my world for like the last 10 years, so. Yes. Yeah.
How do they decide that pricing?
Yeah. So the credit system is, that part is kind of arbitrary. It's more of just an accounting piece. And then there are some, the pricing system for the credits is, that will be determined by the automakers, right? There's like there's a sort of credit economy. So if I'm Toyota and I have a bunch of credits laying around, I can choose to sell them to, let's say, GM, and then these two companies will talk and they will figure out how much, Toyota will say, I want this much, GM will say, how about we pay you this, right? And you can. No, because at the end of the day, the credits are meant to balance out so that sort of across the whole sector, you meet your fuel efficiency requirements. There is a ceiling for the credit prices though, right? And what would that be? What would the ceiling for a credit price be? Yes, exactly. So you would not pay more money than the penalty would cost, right? Because otherwise you would just pay the penalty. So there is kind of a price cap. We actually aren't privy to the credit prices. We know the credit transactions, so we know that like automaker A has sold some number of credits, and we know that automaker B has bought some number of credits, but we don't actually know how much they paid. Yeah. There was a student in TTP maybe 4 or 5 years ago who did a project looking at not cafe credit prices, but the ZEV credit prices. So this is what you were referring to earlier about with Tesla being able to sell them. So it's a similar thing. We'll talk about ZEV in more detail later, but ZEV is the requirement for an automaker to sell some number of electric vehicles, right? Tesla obviously sells only electric vehicles, so they have this huge bank of credits, and they sell their credits to other automakers who maybe can't produce enough electric vehicles. And that can be worth a lot of money. And actually from the period of like 2012 to like 2015 or 16, Tesla was actually reporting the revenue that they were making from selling credits. So then you could go back and look at the transactions from CARB, figure out how many credits were being sold, and then calculate the amount of money on the market a credit would be worth. And it was a lot back then. Like for any single Tesla sold, you could be making like $20,000 in credits, right? So that is one of the ways that Tesla stayed in the green, is actually because of those selling those credits. Yeah, back like 5 or 6 years ago. Any other questions about cafe? We could talk about this all day. Okay, well, if not, I guess we will end a couple minutes early today. This is the end of the lecture.